Hi everyone, my name is Natalie. Today I wanted to do a spring recommendations video in honor of spring finally beginning. So I've done previous recommendations videos where I focus on a season. So I've done one for autumn recommendations and winter. Spring is much harder for me to pin down in books and reading. I guess it's not as obvious when spring is part of a story. In large part, these books are books that I've just read in spring, so I associate them with spring, but I also think they would suit well with the season. So hopefully you will find something interesting here, but I would really love to get your recommendations for books that would be good spring reads. First up we have Emma by Jane Austen. Honestly, any Jane Austen for me is a spring read, partly because of the fact that a lot of them are set in spring. I associate sort of British cozy classics with spring. The flowers in the fields and sort of the sudden storms, and these things just remind me of spring in general, and a lot of my reading of Jane Austen has been in spring, so I think that is probably the main reason that I associate them so strongly with each other. But this is Emma, and this is one of my favorites Jane Austen's of the ones I've read so far. I know Pride and Prejudice is so popular, and I really loved it as well, but I think I think she is more of an interesting character, especially if you are not a big classics reader. She is more recognizable, I think, in a lot of ways. She's quite spunky, and she makes a lot of mistakes, and she is fast to judge, but she also learns from her mistakes, and she grows as the book progresses, but she is not as obviously dependable as a lot of Austen's heroines are. She's not as sort of put together as Elizabeth from Pride and Prejudice, and this book just gave me sort of retro shoujo vibes, which, if you're at all into sort of the era in Japanese manga from the Rose of Versailles, that kind of thing, you'll probably enjoy this book. Another classic that sort of fits into the whole quaint, cozy classics is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Again, this is a book that I actually read in spring. I read it when I was sick, and it was basically the only thing I did. And this is about 4 sisters, and this is definitely very springy because they play a lot in the woods, and they do exploring in the areas around them, and there's so much nature around them, and the whole sort of the focus on nature and being outside is what I associate most strongly with spring reading. So Little Women is just so much fun. It's really heartwarming. It is charming. I know a lot of people love this from their childhood, and it is definitely a classic that would suit well with a young reader. But I think even if you are reading it as an adult reader for the first time, there's a lot of sort of nostalgia in this book. Even though this was published more than 100 years ago, there's a lot of things in this and about childhood and growing up and having siblings and sort of imagining things and playing make-believe. Those things feels very timeless to me. So definitely, if you haven't read this yet, definitely do so, and I would highly recommend reading it in spring. Last for my sort of quaint classics is another children's book, and it is Winnie the Pooh by A. Milne. There's this, and then there's The House at Pooh Corner. I think both of them sort of remind me of all of the seasons, so there are stories in each that deal specifically with spring, and some of the things that happen in spring. Stories themselves are spread out over the year, and I kind of associate parts of them to each and every season. There's something about A. Milne's writing that reminds me of spring, and I guess I just associate A. Milne with sort of bicycling and with having picnics and things like that. The exploring and the having fun outside that I think makes this a pretty good spring reading. Next up we have the only non-fiction book that I have here, and it is Rainbow Dust. 3 Centuries of Delight in British Butterflies by Peter Marren. It is a natural history about butterflies. You start seeing them in spring, and so this book will probably be best read in this time when you can see the topic that you're reading about around you. So I also read this in spring, and I was sort of linking the things I'd read to the sightings I saw around me, the type of butterflies that live in my neighborhood, and also the rarity of them, which is one of the topics that Marren discusses, the extinction of a lot of species of butterflies and the fight to keep them, to protect the butterfly species and the richness of the species. This is sort of part natural history, part a history of people who have studied butterflies, people who have collected them, the understanding of butterflies. I think it will appeal even if you are not really into natural history. It will appeal if you are interested in history, and especially the history of science. I really liked it, and I definitely want to read more books on butterflies, but this is the only one I've read so far, and I highly recommend it for some non-fiction reading for the spring season. The last 2 books are both Japanese fiction books, and I think I associate spring and Japan together because of the fact that there's sort of a tradition of celebrating the arrival of spring in Japan in the way of things like hanami, the flower viewing, and the blossoming of sakura being kind of a big thing that everyone celebrates. And then also one of the things that Japanese fiction has a lot is the slice of life genre. So it's kind of hard to explain if you're not familiar with the term, but it's basically the capturing the small moments in life where basically nothing happens, the everyday situations. I associate it with spring because spring is sort of the calmness before summer where there's so much going on. So anyway, the book that most strongly made me think of spring is The Guest Cat by Takashi Hiraide, which is a book about a couple who end up meeting a neighborhood cat, and the cat sort of invites himself into their house, and it's sort of a neighborhood cat in the way that it goes to different houses in the neighborhood, but it is owned by one particular household. But they start seeing this cat as part of their family, and it is the very slow-paced and very calm and quiet story of these 3 individuals, the couple and the cat, and their relationship and how seasons change. And I just really liked the sense of this, the atmosphere of this. If you're looking for something short and sweet and heartwarming, but also really quiet and, for me, very spring-like, then I think this might be something worth looking up. Lastly, the second Japanese book, but it is a Japanese classic, is The Temple of the Golden Pavilion by Yukio Mishima. I read this a few years ago, and to be honest, I found it quite confusing and dense, but also really beautiful, and it is sort of lingered in my mind throughout that year. So I read it in January to February, I think 2015, and it pretty much was in my head that entire year. And it is about a young man who is a monk in a temple, and is about that temple, the Golden Pavilion. This book deals with this person, this protagonist, being a monk in this temple and his obsession with the temple and how he came to be there in the first place. But it is also about philosophy and about nature around them and religion and how Japan was affected by the war and how they adapt afterwards. There's so many things in this, and it's quite a short book, but it's so so richly created, and to be honest, I feel like I need to reread this to really be able to talk about it in any elegance, but I just again, this sort of makes me think of spring in the way the atmosphere of it. It's very strange, but it's a really interesting book, and if you are at all curious about Japanese classics, this is probably one you should check out. Those were my spring recommendations. I hope you enjoyed this or found this somewhat helpful. If you have, as I said in the beginning, if you have any recommendations for me for spring reading, I would love to hear it. I will link all of these books in the description as I usually do, and I hope you're having a really good day in the beginning of spring, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.